Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I am talking with Chen and Waqas Jawaid of Isometric Studio, which is a studio in New York City that focuses on design that promotes inclusion, equality, and progress. And we use that as a lens to talk about design discourse and the role of criticism in contemporary design practices. Andy and Waqas were the visiting critics here at MICA in December, and I sat down with them while they were here in Baltimore to talk about their backgrounds in both sociology and architecture and how that influences their graphic design work and the way that they think about graphic design. And we talk about the role of writing and criticism in their work and how a robust design discourse can shine a light on often overlooked aspects of the design profession. This was a really, really interesting conversation. They have a unique point of view, and sometimes the two of them actually disagree on things. And so it was fun to talk with them and kind of debate the role of criticism and this type of discourse and how it influences their work. They are very smart and interesting. This was a truly generous conversation. I'm really excited to share it with you. So here is my conversation with Andy Chen and Waqas Jawaid. I thought it would be nice if you could just both kind of introduce yourselves and kind of what you do first, and then from there we'll go into kind of how you got to doing those things.
So my name is Andy Chen. I am a graphic designer. I started by studying sociology, which was unrelated to graphic design, but then found that I had a deep interest in how visual culture informs so much of what we do as human beings in society, right? And so being able to affect visual culture to me felt like a much more active way of creating sort of positive social consequences than simply sort of being a lawyer or so forth, a normal advocacy kind of job. And it also seemed a lot more interesting. Yeah. So then I studied graphic design, and now today we run a graphic design studio.
So when you sorry to but I'm curious if I have two quick questions there. When you started in sociology, what were you thinking kind of going into it before you switched to graphic design you wanted to do?
So I went into college not knowing what I was supposed to be studying because every normal Asian child either needs to become a lawyer or a doctor because those are the kinds of things that our parents know to be successful. And so the thought was that I would either study political science or I would study something like that and become a lawyer because I was no good at math and science. Yeah. And throughout college, there's a very big quandary for me because I didn't really want to become a lawyer. I didn't really like the idea of sort of, having to create a lot of paperwork. And there's, of course, the dramatic flourish of people who are actually litigators, but that's a huge minority, and it's, of course, not realistic. Mm-hmm. So I had a good friend in college. Her name was Tiffany Wei, and she was studying to be an architect. And she approached me at one point about wanting to start a graphic design studio on the campus at Princeton because there was no official curriculum, there was no program, and she essentially, she was the creative side or something, and I was more of trying to figure out the business logistics of it. And we started this small little graphic design agency and got a whole bunch of what are equivalent of student freelancers to work together on poster projects. And that was really exciting and interesting because I started to understand the relationship among business, visual production, and social impact. Mm-hmm. And the design was horrible. It was pretty mediocre for a very long time. And of course, there were some talented people that came through the design agency that made some really nice looking work that got recognized. But throughout, it was just a testing ground for a whole bunch of new visual ideas, for me at least, who didn't have any experience. And then somebody at some point thought to tell me maybe you could do this as a profession.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Why wouldn't you apply for a fellowship to study design instead of applying to become a lawyer? And that was a huge, it was a huge change for me. I didn't realize that this was something you could actually do or that I could actually do. Yeah. But then it seemed intriguing, so I applied for several fellowships, got one in London, studied at the Royal College of Art for a year through a program at what's called the Helen Hamlin Center that deals with graphic design problems and then with a social impact. So I worked on a project that had to do with older people and sexually transmitted infections and how to communicate with them in a way that destigmatizes sex among older people. And the same process I learned in sociology of interviewing people and photographing them, documenting their lives, and then translating that to a kind of design output that was a communication vehicle for some of these ideas. And that was an amazing process because basically it's become the framework for how we run our studio today.
I mean, you just set up like my next 3 questions, so that's perfect. What about you?
I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, and we traveled a lot. And from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to be an artist.
Oh.
And but at the same time, I was also interested in physics and literature and math. And so one of the transformative experiences of my life was to go to India when I was 16 and for a peace conference and meet people there and discover that the history that I've learned and the worldview that I have, including the religion that I was part of, is one of many. And there are people that exist that are really wonderful, amazing people, but may hold totally different views.
Right.
So it really opened up my mind to thinking about how whatever I do affects the world and brings people together. So I ended up at Princeton for undergrad, and I bounced around many different areas of study. And I discovered architecture, and I fell in love with it because it was everything in one. You had this kind of last remaining generalist profession where you can be an artist and a scientist and a economist and whatever. And so I did that, and I really wanted to become an architect, so I went to get a master's in that. And I interned in various places, including Asana in Tokyo and OMA in Rotterdam and also in Paris. And then I landed my dream job, which was at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in New York City.
Yeah.
And we were designing a super tall tower in China. And at that point, I felt a little bit like I stepped back and questioned whether I wanted to continue down that path, because I felt like I was a small part of a big operation, and then I also couldn't control the end product or the value that it was giving back to the communities in these medium-sized Chinese cities. And so at the same time, this opportunity presented itself. I had known Andy for 8 or 9 years, and his business partner was moving on. So then we joked about, and we are partners in life as well. So we joked about working together, and then I saw this as an amazing kind of detour to kind of step into a new direction. And the goal for us was to bring the different disciplines together.
So had you done any quote unquote graphic design?
I was part of the student design agency.
Okay.
I had been exposed to graphic design throughout these years, and I had had a lot of unofficial input on Andy's thesis and projects. But no, I had no disciplinary formal education in design. And even when I joined Isometric, the first few months were very difficult because I would come up with an idea that I thought was amazing, but then I would learn that it's been done many years ago, and this is what it means. And so there was a big learning curve, and I had to learn very quickly. And it was not as easy as it seemed.
Something I'm curious about, and hearing this actually is I'm even more curious about it, but I'm interested in how both of your individual previous professional backgrounds have influenced how you think about Isometric.
So Isometric was founded with the ethic that it would be a studio that cared a lot about social issues. But the problem with that sort of thrust of that argument is that there's already a movement in graphic design that's designed for social change in quotation marks. And I think both of us have doubts about that movement because it's very sociology light. It's very it uses some of the tools of ethnography as a kind of overlay on design process. And then there are firms out there like IDEO that have patented a kind of post-it note design process, sort of soliciting input from users and kind of designing around their needs. And of course, you would want to do that. Of course, you would want to solicit input. Of course, you want to find clever and interesting ways of getting people to participate in the design process. I think that all of that is valid. The challenge is when that becomes a proxy for creating work and having substance that is about sort of the original act of making design, which comes from sort of a deep soulful interpretation of the information at hand. Right. And much in the tradition of Pushpin Studio, Milton Glaser, Paul Scher, there's an act of creation that has to go on that has to elevate all this data above, I think, what is the quotidian kind of visual output that it normally has.
Yeah.
And when there's a process that kind of like is meant to speak for itself, and that becomes an automatic translation of whatever the style of the day is into graphic design, I find it lacking. And so that's why we started the studio with the intent that we work with any client, corporations, startups. We're not afraid of crass commercialism. Instead, we embrace basically clients from any walk of life. And of course, nonprofits and educational institutions tend to find us really appealing. But we work with everybody across the gamut, healthcare corporations, etc., jewelry companies, to try to find where we can create positive impact. Because those sort of people who may not consider these narratives those are the ones that are most vulnerable to critique.
Right.
They're the ones that are perhaps unintentionally promulgating narratives that are sexist or homophobic, or perhaps sort of just like increase income inequality, for example, in real estate. And we can get them to look critically at their values, because nobody wants to be accused of not promoting something positive socially. I mean, not really. Even especially big corporations, they have a lot to lose. And so we positioned ourselves as kind of a generalist firm, taking on basically any kind of client that's willing to work with us, but to have a core of a desire to think about what authentic inclusion looks like, what mining narratives of marginalized people look like, especially when it comes to causes that are not directly sort of, in the social cause, building, saving the world category.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about architecture? How does that, how has your architecture education influenced how you think about design, graphic design?
So initially I used to have a lot of trouble answering that question because it wasn't as clear to me. But more and more, I have begun to see many, connections. So, just kind of on a broad level, thinking about how the process of design, how we go about tackling a problem and working through it with the tools of graphic design. I think that at OMA, I learned that every project always had to be turned on its head.
Right.
If somebody comes in and asks for a library, you're going to give them something that doesn't look like a library at all, and it's questioning the very idea of libraries. And same thing with theater and house and whatnot. So we do try to, with every project, we do try to question the assumptions and kind of re-articulate the project in a way that makes it exciting for us, that creates some kind of friction.
Yeah.
So that even if it is the healthcare company or the real estate company or an exciting nonprofit, we can make it even more exciting so that we get motivated to work on it. So that's a conceptual kind of turning the problem on its head. And then what I learned at Sana was, and I was really baffled when I arrived there and I saw these team meetings where they would sit in silence and look at an architectural model for minutes. And then
no talking at all, just
for a few minutes, just in silence, and they would just kind of turn their heads and look at it from different directions, and then Sejima-san would make a comment, and then Nishizawa-san would literally sit on the chair, perch on the chair and start whistling. And that moment of reflection was so important because then whatever came out of their mouths was actually very considered, very thoughtfully chosen words. And many of the meetings would be held in Japanese, but then they would translate for us. And they said, one of the things I remember was they said, of course, the building has to work functionally.
Right.
But what's more important is that it has to be kawaii, that it has to have this kind of seduction or, cuteness to it that draws people in. So we try, in the United States, working in New York, we work on a very fast-paced schedule, and the projects move really fast, but we try to find moments to pause and reflect. So those are kind of two conceptual ways that architecture informs it. In practical terms, often when we're designing websites or apps, we will do a program diagram very similar to a building, where we will determine what are the various components that need to exist and what is the virtual journey through these components.
Right.
And so we will diagram that out, almost like an architectural diagram, and then build it out from there. And so yeah, those are some of the ways.
Increasingly, a lot of our work is in the built environment. That's been very interesting for me because though I had worked with Paula Scherer, and she does a lot of that kind of work, I had never really directly been responsible for the production of that kind of work. And it was fascinating to me to test the idea of the surface, which is the kind of design, and in architectural space, to say that you have to think about all the approaches, how to, the material, the way that people are going to encounter it, the scale, it's all different, right? And to me, Waqas has been such an amazing resource to kind of get, even though we've been together forever, I never thought that there would be these deep practical questions about how you make something happen that I just have no clue about because I haven't been educated in that way. And to me, it expands the boundaries of what I consider graphic design to be.
Yeah.
And it's super exciting because you have to think very carefully about longevity, which is not necessarily true for most of graphic design, as well as the impact it has sort of passively on the way people experience space. To say that graphic design can tend to be somewhat confrontational, and like what's lauded is bright, bold colors and new kinds of typographic expression and so forth. And that may not be suitable for all cases, particularly in built environments where things are supposed to be more subtle, or restrained, or permanent, or not compete with what else the program is happening in the space. And I think that has made me a much more considerate designer and a much more careful person.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. I actually wanted to talk about architecture for a little bit, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm very fascinated with OMA in general, and I think Rem Koolhaas has influenced how I think about design kind of very deeply. I don't know much about architecture. I read a lot about architecture, but I've never studied it, so I'm approaching it from an outsider. But I feel like OMA and Rem Koolhaas specifically have a very theoretical approach, and you kind of mentioned that of turning the project on its head. But then architecture, in a broad sense, and like the whole profession, seems to have such a rich discourse around criticism and theory. And so I don't know really what my question is, but I guess how has that kind of discourse and how has kind of that theoretical model of OMA manifested itself in your work? And then second part of the question is, why do you think architecture has such a kind of rich discourse around it, or seemingly rich discourse around it?
Yeah, this is a question we battle with almost every day. And our biggest complaint is, why doesn't graphic design have the same kind of discourse as architecture does?
Yeah.
And where does that come from?
That's come up in so many of these interviews that I've done also, by the way.
Yeah, and I don't really have an answer. I think that architecture as a field has existed for a much longer time, and so I think that any kind of creative endeavor has the potential to have a cycle where there's the process of creation, and then there's the process of analysis and critique, and then the critique feeds back into the creation. I think with graphic design, it's been conflated a lot with commercial advertising.
Yeah.
And so people feel that it is too crass. There's no value there. It is a low art. It is not a thoughtful endeavor. And so a lot of academic programs resist even admitting graphic design to be a subject that is taught. For example, at Princeton, there was a lot of resistance before they finally admitted that this was worthy of intellectual inquiry. And so I think that there is some time and work that's needed to bring out the theoretical questions that are related to graphic design and how it impacts the world. Architecture is a very, very slow and ancient profession, So even though, the cars and people's clothes will evolve and change, and you see old photographs, the architecture that seems to be like it's been there forever and will stay for a long time. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of the conversation really builds up. I think another aspect to consider is that architects, at least the intellectual academic architects, really view the discipline as a continuum. So all new projects are built on previous projects. There isn't a fear of copying or getting inspired. The ancient Greek temple is used as a template for new kinds of advancements. And there's the problem of the envelope, or the problem of the entrance vestibule, or whatever, which keeps getting built on. So there is a higher level of disciplinary knowledge that continues even when the various manifestations change and evolve, and some work and some don't. And then there's a whole other aspect of architecture, which is the unbuilt paper architecture.
Right.
That is also part of the critical and theoretical discourse. So
I think there's a question about the legitimacy of something that is so ephemeral and mass-produced, and that's what graphic design has typically been sort of associated with, particularly because there's a tradition of the trade school or even high schools, technical high schools, offering graphic design as a curriculum or a certificate that you can get. You don't need to have any kinds of rigorous theoretical education in order to get some kind of degree in graphic design, or even to practice graphic design. All you need is, ostensibly, is the software. And that has been the kind of way, especially in the United States, that it's been seen. And so I think there's a much greater gamut of what is considered graphic design, and also what is considered part of the graphic design profession. And so that leads to sort of a classist distinction, where architecture tends to be acknowledged by, and also the province of people who are elite and wealthy, and people who can commission buildings, pay for buildings, and be part of that kind of network to be involved in those kinds of projects. Whereas graphic design, your nephew can do it, right? Or like my secretary does some graphic design, right? Like you hear that often, and it's not as derisive as it sounds. And what it means is that there's an opportunity there. Everybody kind of knows it, even though they don't know it. And I see that as a positive thing, because, and then you can find the right institutions or whatever to support more rigorous kind of work that does have, value beyond its visual appearance and beyond styling. And that's probably true for architecture as well, because some things are considered architecture, like picking furniture and matching colors, that are not really have to do with argument in space, right? So I think that graphic design has a long way to evolve. That architecture has already had that kind of evolution and that testing ground, and the graphic design education kind of, I think, needs to catch up in that way by seeking to educate people in ways that are not just about sort of graphic design reflecting on itself as a discipline, trying to legitimate itself relative to the discourse of other disciplines. So and this argument has been made, meaning what I don't mean is the argument that is made in the Looking Closer books, where the Looking Closer books kind of, there was an argument about, well, graphic design needs its own meta discourse about graphic design. I don't think that's necessarily true, because it hasn't been particularly helpful. What has come out of that is the production of design in academic institutions that is for designers only. And that kind of exclusion of or desire for something that is outside of culture or outside of the social implications of what we do, or the economics of what we do, is a desire to have an academic removal, just like you would have in any other field. And presumably that is going to be more rigorous, right? Because there's an investigation of what then design means. But the problem...
Don't you think that's important to have?
Sure. I have no problem with it by itself. But I think that you should have that plus the social context and cultural context. And that they need to be seen as mutually constitutive, rather than robbing each other of some kind of importance. And that these like sort of little ghettoized programs of like design for social change here and graphic design over there, that is poisonous, because it it implies that SVA is the commercial school, and you go there because like you want to be it's like a finishing school, and Yale is the academic one, and RISD is somewhere in between with semiotic theory. These are unimportant distinctions. I think we should be open-minded as a field.
Yeah.
I think that we should push towards bringing in as much theory from other fields, because we are a generalist discipline, as possible. Feminist theory, literary theory, which has already been explored by the McCoys, and social theory, economic theory, scientific theory. I think that we should be interested in everything because our clients are. And that when we are, we'll be able to more rigorously develop models of design practice that will live up to the desire to be something like architecture.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at my notes, and you've set up all the rest of my questions in those two responses. So let me figure out how I want to kind of parse this out, because I think I agree 100% with everything that you just said, and that's a lot of what I've been thinking about and trying to parse out. And so I want to start with kind of connecting two things, and one is that kind of rich architecture discourse, and then the kind of academic discourse. And something I've been thinking about a lot and trying to pick apart a little bit is that architecture has a rich theoretical discourse, but then for a long time, every major newspaper also had an architecture critic that was for a general audience. And so I guess, let's talk a little bit about kind of design criticism and discourse and audience. And what is something I've been thinking about a lot is the value of the discourse for the profession, which I think is important, but then also for people who are not designers and maybe know the term graphic design, but don't actually know what it is. And so I'm curious about the value that you see in kind of both of those conversations that could and should be happening, or maybe should be happening.
I guess I'll start with...
I think we have different opinions on this.
Okay, interesting.
So, my opinion is that standalone academic discourses are boring and exclusive, meaning that if I'm going to comment on graphic design by Metahaven that's been produced exclusively for the consumption of other graphic designers and or architects, or the Lars Mueller kind of way, I'm going to get really Dexter Sinister. I value that they exist in the profession. I strongly do, and I believe that they have fundamentally transformed the profession in a very positive way. At the same time, I would like to see design criticism about mainstream subjects. And the reason is that it connects to a broader audience. So, for example, my example would be the recent movie Moonlight by director Barry Jenkins. Is been lauded as a film masterpiece for a number of reasons. But the critic A.O. Scott from the New York Times, to me, that was a masterwork in itself, the piece of criticism, very short.
The piece that he wrote about it? Yeah, it was great.
Beautiful, where he talked about how it's at once a film about Black queer identity, but it's not specifically about that because it fails to fall into normal traps of reducing people into symbols. And instead, it forges what he cited Hart Crane, the poet, called infinite consanguinity, the ability to be connected to other people in a way that transcends space and time. And to me, that's just such a beautiful description of that film, and also a critical comment on how it performs socially and culturally. So what I like about it is that it bears some degree of the sentiment of the film. And some people are very afraid of emotion and sentimentality and describing emotion because it's worrying. But as kind of critics like Jessica Helfand showed us, desire, emotion, these things are important to make it critical. And when we do, it automatically connects to a wider audience because human beings have emotions. The wider audience of human beings have emotions. And we're no longer just talking about is the quality of this typeface like the counterforms and okay, is it what does it respond to within design history? Like, those are important questions, but they've been asked and somewhat they've been tried to answered. What is the important question now is we live in a Trump era where a lot of people feel really scared. You have major conflict around the world that seems irresolvable. You have the information is moving faster than ever before, so you see police shootings of Black people on a regular basis. how do we confront these questions as graphic designers? And I don't mean that everybody has to do the work that we do by any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe that everybody has to all of a sudden do socially good work. No. Instead, you should have a stake in it.
Yeah.
You should care about it in some ways, and you should believe that you are a conduit to communicate some of at least your own values, if not the values of the people you represent.
Right.
Well, I think the Moonlight is an interesting example because the review that you mentioned is very beautifully written, but to a large extent, it focuses on the effects of the movie, right? It doesn't take us behind the scenes to talk about the magic that is involved in creating the film. You know, the kind of camera that is used, the mechanics. You know, the how it relates to previous films, and how, you know, there's just a whole criticism that could be written on the use of color, the use of the camera,
and it
the
had been
use
written,
of,
but not by him.
you know, and how it is building on the work that is coming from previous filmmakers. And so when filmmakers go and see that movie, they see something totally different, right?
Sure.
And when they read the New York Times review, they think that it is written for a general audience. Now that is, of course, very important, but at the same time, I think that as a discipline, if graphic design is going to advance this knowledge of the behind-the-scenes magic, so more and more people can really understand the tools of the trade, and also understand if an image is used in a specific way, what does that convey, and what effect that has on you know, human beings, that can really benefit the discipline. And sometimes that is a very close conversation that only happens in universities and only with, you know, knowledgeable critics. And I think that architecture has that, because when we talk about architectural criticism, we are really looking at the 1% of, you know, architects who are engaged in that.
Right.
There's a huge building industry that doesn't really care about this, but that somehow will get influenced by the ideas that are generated in these conversations. So
yeah, and I think you talk about Jeff Kipnis often, how he talks about architecture as creating emotional effects through form. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
And I think that both those sides are equally as important. The idea of effects and form, and it comes up in Diller Scofidio Renfro's work, for example, the special effects machine, and the idea that you can create affect with formal devices. And that's basically all there is to the production of design.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of an understatement, but that's really interesting then, because both sides are important. The idea of what are the mechanics that add up to this, and why are we so afraid of revealing kind of trade secrets? There aren't really any. It's that if you combine this set of materials, it produces a certain set of emotional effects through cultural connotations or through social connotations. And the prism of how all these things happen, I think, is incredibly important to analyze, as Waqas is saying, basically as a kind of teaching and instructive educational response to design. At the same time, I think that making that available to a broader audience, whether it's the mechanics or the effects or the social meaning, I think that that's critical. And so it's like these various levels of theory building, which are present in other fields, for example, ethnography, and sociology, basically how you tier an argument, right? That you talk about the mechanics of how the field work was done. Then you talk about what are the effects of, you know, using certain kind of mechanics over others. And then you theorize about, okay, what does it mean to this particular social problem, for example, inequality in inner cities. And then you have opposing theories that are reconciled or synthesized in a new theory. And that is the kind of theory building that I was taught. Unfortunately, that level of rigor is just simply not existent in graphic design. You can go through whole critiques in schools without touching on any greater body of theory. And that to me is sad, because I believe that the students are fully capable of doing it. And I don't believe that it's really taught in that way. The equivalent of graphic design theory classes are sort of reading Lev Manovich and like Jurgen Lany, and all these are important figures, but there's kind of like, isn't anybody truly building a theoretical platform for in the way that other fields have?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot the more of these interviews that I've done, is that kind of graphic design Let me think exactly how to phrase this, because I kind of fall on both sides, and it like depends kind of what kind of day I'm having of which one I fall on. But I think design theory or design criticism really gets interesting when it starts connecting with things outside of the profession. And especially in a Trump world, I feel like graphic designers need to be talking about these things in the context of the world that we're living in now. And so I don't know if I have a question there other than just kind of reconfirming what you were saying.
But it's not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
I still believe that designers can write about like what it means to draw a line from left to right rather than right to left. And you can you can write about that. I don't have any problems with that being part of the discourse. And what a particular use of color means, or what does it mean to use letter space typography that is illegible? Like these questions that came up in the 90s.
Right.
But I found that to be a rather facile error that kind of Stephen Heller wrote The Cult of the Ugly, and he took it back. And fine. And then there are all sorts of new models around like designer as entrepreneur, designer as author, or whatever that means. And like, why are we struggling to try to define what graphic design is?
Right.
Why? I feel like that's a pointless endeavor at this point. Like that you do not have to create provinces and kind of try to sequester your particular mode of expertise and area of expertise. Instead, I think we should be generous to all different people making all different things that they call graphic design, and that we should address them on the level that they're talking about and the subject that they're talking about. And that should be the mode that's available for critique. Very similar to studying English or Romance languages or whatever. You would not expect that that is like, I had a professor who's an amazing theorist, and she writes about Asian American literature, but she also brings film criticism and architectural criticism into her work. And she's worked with architectural critics like Beatrice Colomina, writing about the skin and Adolf Loos and how that affects her reading of a particular kind of literature.
Oh, interesting.
And to me, that approach is what graphic design should be about. Because if graphic design is basically about designing everything else, then you need a clearly multidisciplinary approach. You need to be widely read in the fields that your design addresses. And I think that should be a requirement. And so when I'm not saying that we're perfect and this is what we do with every project. I mean, there's time constraints on everything.
Right.
But I do think we try really hard to get the core of what it's about. And especially when we have academic clients or educational institution clients, they demand a level of rigor. And so we go in and we show that we have thought about the greater theoretical underpinnings of their work, whether it's on spreading international culture or the feminist movement or the LGBT movement. We look at the history. We look at the history particularly cited to the area that we're working in. We think about what the theoretical argument that is being made is. We bring in theory that they may not be acquainted with, and then we show them visual form that's related to those theories, or at least our interpretation of it. And to me, it's a way of building new theories that have visual substance to them.
Right.
So.
And you actually do that. Like, you will present those types of things.
We don't go in with like a mood. I mean, we can't. Basically, in terms of our way of doing and being in the world, we have a really hard time with like mood boards or like typographic collages or like a grid of like where you lay in terms of all these different brands in a 2x2 matrix. We can't do that. It's like pseudoscientific to us. And also, we're frankly not experts on how you should market your product. Instead, we view design as an intellectual argument. And for it to be an argument, you need to know what's come before. And you need to know how you're turning the argument on its head, or framing it in a way to look at it in a different direction.
You also need to be able to articulate why not to do it another way.
Right.
So, in some sense, we are trying to move away from this the way of talking about design as nice or not nice that we've seen a lot, and try to go into the realm of why or why not. And that, I think, involves some level of theory from either design or other related fields.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, because that hits on two things that I'm really interested in. One, I love the design as an intellectual argument, and that's kind of part of, kind of a couple levels down, but part of my thesis and what I'm doing here is that all design is critical and theoretical in some way, and that can manifest itself, with like a knowledge of history, but it can also manifest itself with that surface layer also. And I really like the why, or nice and not nice, and more into why, because I think that kind of hits in the kind of criticism that I'm hoping to kind of find and bring together through all of this, and that there is this kind of depth to what we do.
I mean, would you say, so one question I have for you is that I often struggle with the same question you struggled in 2006. Because in some ways, Isometric has a house style. Like, we like shifting lines of typography. Yep. We like some gestures from postmodernism. Like, we like glittery looking typography. But we're also not stylists, I don't think, right? Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, raises an important theoretical question that I have had a hard time struggling with, because if graphic design is supposed to be generalist and you're supposed to be able to give your form to all sorts of different clients and different ideas, then this question of personal style and personal investment becomes increasingly important to forming a quote-unquote critical design practice. Because if you do have a personal stake in it and you want to put some of your mark as an artist in the work, can it still be critical in its function as it addresses a whole bunch of different audiences and clients?
I think that none of the work that we produce is any individual's style. Mm-hmm. It is a result of a conversation that happens in the studio that mm-hmm. involves the two of us, but also our designers, Nicole and Jihei. I think that one way to think about the work that we do is that it's not postmodern, because postmodern was a critique of modernism, mm-hmm. and it was about mm-hmm. rejection, and it was about poking fun, and postmodernism, I think, led all the way up to the 2008 economic collapse, and then something new emerges. And I think that what we look back to as a studio, I think you will agree, is modernism, which is the early 20th century. For the first time, art and design becomes political, mm-hmm. and there is this hope and aspiration that because of the tools of the Industrial Revolution, housing and art and design can be brought to the common person. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were a lot of flaws with it, a lot of problems, and it led to a lot of catastrophes. But this desire was there, and art for the first time becomes political, and Benjamin writes about that. And now we've gone through that cycle of postmodernism, mm-hmm. and what we are seeing now is a kind of new modernism. I don't know what it's going to be called. Well, people in the future will decide.
I like to call it like kind of eclectic constructivism, and because I kind of look to the work of Abbott Miller as a model for our studio. He has kind of digested and created, and Michael Beirut, every design style that has come through history, and kind of re-outputted it with his own aesthetic lens and discernment.
Interesting.
And so that's kind of what we do. We show benchmarks of other designers' work or historical work that is relevant to a particular project, mm-hmm. and then we reproduce some of that form, but with the intent of the people in the studio, right? Not any, like Waqas said, no one person has an aesthetic say.
Instead, I will say that the word eclectic is meant as an insult in architecture because it means you're not consistent, you are eclectic. And so someone like Philip Johnson is derided with using this kind of euphemism, work is really eclectic, and that's supposed to be insulting.
But are you okay with that?
I don't think we're eclectic in the sense that I don't think we are random or all over the place. I think that if you look back at our work, there is a lot of consistency to it.
But eclectic just means drawing from a wide variety of influences.
Oh, yes. But when you say eclectic, I hear that you're making work that looks like it's all over the place. Okay. So we should workshop that.
Well, I love that this conversation has become like a way for you guys to talk out the studio a little bit. Yeah. I have just a couple more questions that I want to ask just to kind of start to wrap it up. Something that I really like is on the Isometric website, you say that you're a studio that promotes inclusion, equality, and progress. I really like that, and I wanted to look at those three words through the lens, and we kind of talked about this a little bit already, but through the lens of criticism, and how is it possible, or how could design criticism and design discourse also be inclusive and diverse and progressive? in a way that it's not right now?
I would say that these words are, of course, loaded, and they've been used by other people. And so we struggled with, like, what do we do? And we just wanted one line, right? We asked our clients to do it. And I think that we chose these words because of our own identity as LGBT people of color. And that, like, why not? You know, if you're going, meaning if you're going to put a stake in the ground and say, you know, this is what we do, and if you're hiring us, this is what you're going to get, right? And you're going to get a considerate lens on all kinds of problems, but particularly problems that are challenging to solve around representation. And I think that people in the field, if I understand correctly, and I've like met enough designers, they generally care about this stuff anyway. But that the outlet for it has been get out the vote campaigns or sort of political posters, and that has been like the tenor of socially inclusive design. And on the other hand, the IDEO model, or what I learned at the Helen Hamlin Center at the Royal College of Art, which is quote unquote inclusive design, which is kind of like service design, designing for people with disabilities and so forth. And I think that there is good intention in all of these different models, and I'm not claiming that, you know, we kind of take whatever works. And what I think makes sense is for a graphic design practice to understand the stakes of, you know, what everybody's particular project has on the culture that it affects and the outside world. And this is particularly true for schools like MICA, where there is an emphasis on, well, what is the impact of what your design is doing, and how do I make it real, while not removing it from the sort of academic and critical context where you can take risk. And I think that I think that's a really positive thing, and I think that should be the model that's promoted everywhere. I think that you know, that basically schools that have an overemphasis on getting people jobs and training them with enough formal skill to be rigorous in that way need to think carefully about their history and their sort of, you know, their context courses, their introduction to graphic design. I think it needs to be more than just, you know, looking at visuals and analyzing what their role is in history, but also mining what does it mean for us today? How can we be invested in you know, what we read in the paper? How can that translate to a level of self-scrutiny about the discipline?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges when we chose to put that on the website was, what if people think that we're not serious designers? And that is a real risk, because when people think of social design, they usually think of post-it notes and, you know, bad typography, and those are the kinds of images that are conjured. But we really do believe that all design is social, that graphic design is an exploration of, you know, a questioning of the human endeavor, and something that informs back on, you know, how we view ourselves and how we interact with others. And something as simple as a typographic choice and scale and color can sway people in different directions, and the right choice of words. And so we think, you know, all design is social, and that's kind of our, I guess, our thesis.
So that's like Paula Scher's thesis. Like, she literally gave a presentation that's called "All Design is Social," as a way of sort of refuting claims that, okay, she works with Citibank, does that mean that she's evil? Like, of course not. It's utterly ridiculous, and it's this black and white, like, you know, very juvenile way of looking at things. Although, like, so I would say that all design is social, true, but not all design is socially inclusive. Not all design is socially progressive. And that's why we chose the words that we did. You know, inclusion, equality, progress. These are ways that we want to affect society with design, right? And that doesn't mean that we're not open to sort of people who have very conservative values or Republicans. Like, we work with them. Those are part of our body of work as well. And we take pride in that, the ability to reach across these lines seriously and to have real discussions and to create fruitful design responses that are not a closed loop. Meaning, your design doesn't have to compel everybody, one. Two, it doesn't have to have a singular point of view. As a form of artistic production, I think we should just be frank that it is a kind of art. It opens it up to subjectivity. It opens itself up to ambiguity, ambivalence. Right? It can be all these things. Why does it have to be any narrow thing?
Right.
And that is the beauty. And so there has been so much critical discourse around like how subjective is it? How objective is it? Like, why these and the desire to superimpose semiotic theory in that way that kind of forces it into a box. And I would say what we believe is that true critique continually opens the imagination. It continually opens what the possibilities of design could be. And and it has to be informed by a link to how design is produced. So this is the final point I really wanted to make. That so often I think we're afraid of talking about the economics of how design is produced, not just like the economic conditions more broadly, but the specific circumstances around how you get a design sold to a committee of people, to individuals. I feel like that is not part of the critical discourse. But I think it is critical because
that's interesting.
Because what I think we're afraid of, and many fields are afraid of, is becoming crass and commercial. But you risk that more if you hide the way to sell really compelling design to an audience, right? Like, and it's better, I think, to be frank and open about it. So Paula Scher and Michael Beirut and Armin Witt are really good models of this. But Armin even talks about how he bills his clients and how much his studio earns a year. I think I don't think everybody has to be so frank and so open, but I would like the discipline to move in that direction more, because as young designers, particularly people who are not from an elite background, who don't have a whole lot of family capital supporting us, or any, who are basically self-sustaining, had to build the practice on the ground. What we lack most is a network of people we can rely on for questions.
Right.
Like, we can turn to our mentors, and sometimes they'll give us really thoughtful responses, but they had a different journey, right? Among peers our age, 20s, 30s, who have to try to make it in this field, which is competitive, which is always under sort of economic threat, always feels really transient. How can we support each other in ways that elevate our critical discourse and also open up economic opportunities for each other? More than just finding each other jobs, telling, like, how do you convince a client to do this? And how do you bill? How do you make sure they pay you? How do you what do you incorporate as? These are all questions that basically are taken completely for granted. And I think that that's really important to the discussion of design critique as well. So
yeah, it's true, and that's something that architects have a really hard time with, because it requires so much more capital to build a building. So they are very uncomfortable talking about that. And related to what you said is, and I think you mentioned this, how do you convince committees or people to do a certain project, and how do you shape the forces of power to get a job in the first place? And things are changing. There's a lot of startups and there's a lot of nonprofits who are beginning to become aware of the value of design. So there's a lot to kind of talk about and learn about
that actually kind of, you started to actually lead into what my last question was, and we talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to end with just what are issues, topics, things that should be a part of the design discourse, and that can be both like within us as the profession, but also that the general kind of population should kind of be talking about or learning about as it relates to design. And so I think like the business side of things and the economic side of things is actually really fascinating.
And AIGA, frankly, has tried. Like, they have a GAIN conference, but it's really expensive to attend. And so no problem with that. I think, like, great. And I just think we need an alternative as well.
Totally.
Or at least an alternative, either within or without that institution, that helps us sort of craft what the next generation of designers should look forward to, and to create meaningful mentorship opportunities that are more than ladder climbing. Like, what happens after you stop caring about, like, awards? We don't generally enter awards competitions. We don't, and primarily because, like, we don't want to be under the threat of that as well. Meaning, like, have to put ourselves emotionally out there to just have our design evaluated without the context of why it was produced the way it was. And AIGA has tried to remediate this problem by in what I feel is a misguided direction of asking about the design's function and its results, and its and that addressed a lot of controversy as well, because designers were then saying, well, what about just formal pleasure and like like what if we instead of thinking about award schemes and these kind of things as revenue drivers, right? What if the revenue drivers were platforms for people to share their ideas and to participate in this conversation without like huge exorbitant fees, if it would just spread more widely, and to address topics that are of real concern to people who are in the minority. For example, AIGA did try to do an event about Black Lives Matter, or something about race and design, but the problem was that they made it like an online event, and it was really poorly advertised. Gray Advertising had this event where famously where I think they had like a panel on Black graphic design, or I'm not sure. I'm sorry, that might be a mistake. Don't quote me.
We can cut this part out.
It may have been. I'm not sure which advertising agency did it, but then they had a Twitter picture of all white people sitting.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I saw this.
And I just like we need to be more self-aware as a discipline.
Yeah.
I don't mean that everybody should sort of be socially engaged in that kind of way.
But I know what you mean.
I think that like there are Black graphic designers, there are Asian graphic designers who don't fit the model of sort of passive people. There are Latino graphic designers. There are designers that come from all walks of life, and I think that we need to provide a platform that lifts people up. And gives them the opportunity to have their voice heard, if only to make design more robust and more fruitful. When Lucille Tenazas created her design, when Rebecca Mendez started to make a stake in the world of graphic design, those were beautiful moments, because all of a sudden there was a blooming of a whole new way of aesthetically approaching questions, critically approaching questions. In order for critical discourse to grow, you need that level of difference. You need that level of openness. And so I think that we should demand that design embrace that level of intellectual openness. And that will give us a greater platform for truly having a sense of disciplinary inquiry and substance.
I could add a little bit to that. I think that graphic design in particular can really affect the way that institutions work. A lot of the continuity politically that exists in the United States is the way in which institutions ensure that there are checks and balances, and design helps articulate this kind of democratic function of these institutions. So just thinking about how a visual identity or messaging for a contemporary institution might be different from IBM or one of the older mid 20th century ones, and how that affects the way in which they view themselves and the way they function. Then another aspect is how people's stories are told. How do we humanize undocumented immigrants, or how do we humanize Syrian refugees and tell their stories? And graphic design has a huge role to play in that, to create this kind of empathy and connection. How do we shape digital worlds? I think that there are these bubbles that people live in, and design people can. Yesterday we saw in the Masters Review, how can we begin to question some of the digital realms that rooms that exist, and facilitate connection. And then finally, this idea of physical space. How do we give people a sense of the physical reality of a place where people can come and interact and learn from each other? And I think as we move forward into the 21st century, that's going to be a really important thing for designers to do. You can't do all of that at once, but I think a broader awareness of that as we approach every project is important, because we have so much power to shape the work of the clients that work with us. So
you talk about the Harvard professor you had who said about design can change longing to belonging. Right, and that's kind of like a cute little linguistic trope, but I really feel like that undergirds so much of what we care about. I think there is a desire for everybody to feel like they belong, and that their voice matters, and that when that's resisted, it leads to dire consequences, as we can see in the last election.
Right.
And that if we are going to make for progress, then we need to listen to those voices who have felt that they have been unheard.
Yeah.
And instead of just blaming them for their ignorance.
Yeah. I think that is a perfect way to wrap this up. This has been so interesting. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time and for talking with me. This was great. This episode was recorded on December 13th, 2016 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter @Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.